Sitting in the very office I built over 40 years, I had to watch my son, dressed in an expensive suit, mock my entire life's work. He slid a contract across the table, offering to buy the ship for just $50, his voice cold, "Sign it, or I'll have you committed for losing your mind." At the time, everyone thought the ship was nothing but scrap. Until day 10, when an old diver looked at the blueprint, I found one bulkhead short by 18 inches and suddenly shouted, "Stay away from the engine room." Right now, I didn't understand until I pried the steel panel open. I froze. Beneath it wasn't rust. It was proof of a horrific crime my son had buried along with my wife's life. I'm grateful you're here. Tell me in the comments. What city, what country are you joining from today? Let's see how far this story has traveled. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, but the meaning behind every scene is something I genuinely believe you needed to hear. I have sat in that room hundreds of times. I know the cold of that air conditioning, the kind that bites the back of your neck before you've pulled out your chair. I know the way morning light slides through the east-facing glass and catches the Voss Marine logo on the far wall, making the anchor and wheel glow like something permanent. I know the smell of that room's stale coffee, recycled air, and 40 years of decisions I made sitting at the head of a long black oak table. That Tuesday morning in June, I pushed open the glass door and stopped. The coffee hadn't been brewed. That was the first thing. The second thing, the thing that sat heavier, was that my son did not stand up when I walked in. Callum was in my chair. He had on a navy suit, London cut, the kind that costs more than a month's wages for most men on my dock floor. A Patek Philippe on his left wrist. Hair slicked back. His cologne reached me before he looked up, and when he did look up, it was only briefly, the way you glance at something you've already decided isn't worth your full attention. Pemberton Cross sat in my usual seat, second from the head. He was tapping his fingers against the table. When I caught his eye, he looked down at the papers in front of him. The other 3 board members did the same. I walked to the far end of the table, pulled out the last empty chair, and sat down. Nobody offered me coffee. Nobody said good morning. Callum opened his folder. This is a formal resolution of the Voss Marine Industries Board of Directors, he said, reading in a flat, rehearsed tone, the same voice he used for earnings calls. Effective immediately. Sterling Voss is removed from his position as chairman of the board and chief executive officer. The motion has been prepared and seconded. All in favor. Pemberton raised his hand. The other 3 followed. 4 votes, enough. I looked at my son across the length of that table. I kept my voice low. How long have you been planning this? Callum smiled at the table. He didn't answer. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and spoke to the room as though I had already left. Sterling Voss was a great engineer of the last century, but we are living in this one. Then he turned to me directly, the first time all morning. You have 2 hours to clear your office and your home. Leave the keys with security. I didn't respond. My eyes went to the logo on the wall behind him, the anchor and wheel I had sketched in 1984 on a paper napkin in a dockside coffee shop after a 12-hour shift. Rosalind had laughed when she saw it, said it looked like something a child drew. Then she folded the napkin and kept it in her coat pocket for 6 years. The same design was now cast in brushed steel behind my son's head. Callum slid a contract across the table, thin, maybe 4 pages. A standard Voss Marine asset disposition formed, the kind the company used to offload old equipment and decommission vessels. Callum signed dozens of these every month without reading them. I could tell by the way he pushed it toward me, not an offer of formality. The Iron Meridian, he said. You always had a soft spot for that old dredger. $50, 30 days, Make her leave port under her own power before the deadline, and you walk away clean. He slid the pen across after the contract. If you can't, you sign over your remaining shares and check yourself in for psychiatric evaluation. 3 physicians completed their assessments last week. They all agree your level of obstinacy is clinically concerning. He was looking at his phone when he said that last part. I could see it in the way he pushed the contract toward me. To him, this was paperwork. He had already decided the outcome not because he had studied it, but because he hadn't needed to. The ship was a condemned hull. The old man had no tools, no crew, no allies. 30 days was generous. He expected I'd be done in 10. I picked up the contract and read it. By the second minute, Callum was checking his watch. By the time I turned to page 2, he shifted in his chair the way he used to as a boy, when I made him sit through equipment manuals restless, impatient, certain that understanding a thing was less important than moving past it. He never had patience for page 2. Clause 7b sat at the bottom of the second page. Small print, standard legal language, the kind that reads dry enough to skip, precise enough to bind. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The way I used to read structural tolerances before signing off on a hull. "You've read enough," Callum said. "Sign it." I signed. I folded the contract and placed it in my chest pocket. Callum extended his hand. "That document is company property." I looked at him. "I just purchased it. For $50. It belongs to me." He glanced at Pemberton. Pemberton looked away because legally there was nothing to argue. The contract was executed. The asset had transferred. Callum gave a small nod, the gesture of a man dismissing something too minor to contest, and reached for his phone again. I pushed in my chair and walked to the door. In the elevator, I pressed the lobby button and felt the building drop away beneath me. My right hand rested flat against my chest over the folded paper in my pocket. The language in Clause 7b was not Callum's language. It wasn't drafted by any attorney I recognized from our standard legal team. It was precise in a different way, chosen the way a shipwright chooses steel for load-bearing, for what it has to hold under pressure. There was only one person I had ever known who wrote that way, and she had been gone for 3 years. I had stood on Dock 7 1,000 times in my life. I knew the give of those planks underfoot the way the wood softens near the waterline where river spray never fully dries. I knew the smell, diesel and salt and rust, that particular chemical undertone that clings to every working port along the Gulf Coast. But that evening I arrived with a canvas duffel on one shoulder, $50 spent, and no key to the house I had built 40 years ago. The sun was going down behind the tree line across the Neshes, turning the water the color of old copper. I stood at the end of the dock and looked at the iron meridian for the first time in 7 years. She was worse than I expected, and I had expected bad. 65 feet stem to stern, flat-bottomed, built for river dredging rather than open water. The white paint above the waterline had peeled back in long curling strips to expose gray steel underneath, streaked brown and orange where rust had been working inward for years without anyone to stop it. Yellow barrier rope stretched between 2 dock posts. A laminated condemned notice hung from the middle, its plastic gone brittle from years in the weather. I stepped over the rope without breaking stride. The gangway ladder was bolted to the port side. I remembered the 3rd rung had cracked in 2017. I stepped over it without looking the same way you step around a loose board you stopped thinking about years ago. I spent the next hour going bow to stern with my flashlight and my notebook. The cabin floor flexed under my weight. Near the center, dry rot working upward from below. 2 windows were missing entirely. Frames included leaving open holes the weather had used freely. The main engine was a fused mass of corrosion. The primary shaft would not turn by hand, which meant the bearings had likely seized solid. The bilge pump had been partially stripped, impeller housing gone, 2 check valves missing. Not weather damage. Someone had come aboard and removed them deliberately. The cargo hold had 8 inches of standing water. black still with a surface sheen that caught my flashlight in colors that had no business being in any bilge I had ever seen. I wrote it all down, not a work list, but a technical breakdown. Location, condition, probable cause, estimated scope. I had carried the same style of notebook since 1979, wire-bound graph paper, margins just wide enough for a second column. Rosalind used to say I loved that notebook more than I loved conversation. She wasn't wrong. I was on the stern deck when boots hit the gangway below. Gideon Pruitt swung himself over the rail and stopped when he saw me. He had on his Port Authority vest, high-vis orange, the reflective strips worn thin at the shoulders from years of use. His face was tight in a way that had nothing to do with the climb up. Sterling, he exhaled. I didn't know you'd come today. Gideon had been portmaster at Beaumont for 11 years. Before that, he had worked the dock crews for nearly 3 decades, much of it, alongside Voss Marine Operations. We had known each other since before either of us had gray in our hair. Who else knows I'm here? I asked. Callum called me this morning. He sat on the stern rail, not quite looking at me. Before the board meeting, he said if I give you any assistance, any at all, my contract renewal disappears. He was specific about what assistance meant. I nodded and kept writing. I've worked with you 40 years. Gideon said. Callum can have the contract. Don't, I said. Not yet. The river moved around us, the slow knock of the hull against dock fenders, the distant horn of a tanker pushing up the channel toward the refineries. I looked out at the water and let myself have one moment, 1989, the day we launched this vessel. Rosalind wore a red dress and stood on the bank clapping with both hands raised over her head, the way she did whenever she decided something was worth celebrating. Callum had been 3 years old. He sat on my shoulders the whole afternoon, pulling at my hair, asking when the boat was going to move. Gideon's voice dropped. There's something else. I shouldn't be saying this. He glanced toward the dock office at the far end of the pier. Last week I got a call. Didn't come from Callum's office, different number, different voice. They asked how deep the water runs at Dock 7. Then they asked how long the Iron Meridian had been moored here. I set my pen down. They give a name. He shook his head. No name. But they knew what the ship was called before I mentioned it. I held that for a moment. Then I picked the pen back up. An hour later, I went below to the engine room. The smell hit me before I reached the bottom rung, not diesel, not bilge, but something chemical and low and close. The kind that settles at the back of your throat and stays. I crouched near the base of the engine housing and put my flashlight on the buildup along the inner hull wall. The residue was deep purple, almost crystalline, where it had dried a color and texture I had never seen on any engine casing in 40 years of this work. I touched it with 2 fingers. It did not smear. I brought my hand to my nose. Metal and something faintly sweet the way certain acids smell before they begin to eat. I wrote it down. Every detail, every measurement, I could estimate the exact location on the hull. The same way I had always written things I didn't yet understand, but knew I would need to explain. I climbed back to the main deck and sat in the dark cabin with the flashlight resting on my knee. The dock lights outside threw long, orange shapes across the river. The building was quiet. Then below me, beneath the cargo hold, floor below the 8 inches of black water, I heard something that was not the river and not the hull shifting against the dock. It was intermittent, uneven, water finding its way through a space it shouldn't be in. Or water contained in a space that appeared on no schematic I had ever reviewed for this vessel. I opened my notebook to a clean page and wrote 4 words at the top. There is another compartment. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the forward cabin of the Iron Meridian with my jacket pulled over my shoulders, listening to the niches work against the steel hull, and I thought about purple, about the specific shade of it on that inner wall, too deep for corrosion, too crystalline for grease, too deliberate-looking to be anything accidental. By 4 in the morning, I had stopped pretending to rest. By 6, I had washed my face with water from a dock hose, changed my shirt from the duffel, and was walking toward the hospital. Not because I was sick. Because Christus St. Elizabeth was the one place in Beaumont where I knew someone was already asking the same question I was. The 4th floor smelled the way hospitals always do, antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both that no amount of cleaning ever quite reaches. The fluorescent lights were the flat white kind that make everyone look like they haven't slept, which at 7 in the morning was accurate for most of the people I passed. A medication cart rolled by on the linoleum with a rhythmic squeak that echoed down to the nurse's station. I asked the desk nurse about the physician handling the heavy metal poisoning cases. She looked at me the way people look at someone who has said something they weren't supposed to know. "Dr. Carre doesn't take outside visitors during patient rounds," she said. "If you'd like to leave a name." I told her my name and sat down on the bench across from the station. 20 minutes later, a woman in a white coat came around the corner at a pace that suggested she had been walking that fast all morning and intended to keep doing so. Brown hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes that had moved past, tired into something more permanent. She stopped when she saw me and looked at me with the particular wariness of someone who has learned not to trust unexpected visitors. "You're the one asking about my patients." It wasn't a question. "I'm a ship engineer," I said. "I found something last night in the engine compartment of a vessel moored on the Netches." I held up the Ziploc bag, the purple crystalline residue I had scraped from the inner hull wall, sealed in plastic since midnight. "I wanted to know if this color means anything to you." Vivienne Carr looked at the bag. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has been waiting for a piece to arrive and isn't sure yet if it's the right one. She looked at me, then back at the bag, then down the hallway in both directions. "Come with me," she said. The small conference room off the nursing station had a table, 4 chairs, and a whiteboard, with discharge notes still written in red marker. She closed the door behind us and opened her laptop without sitting down. She turned it toward me. 14 files. 14 children ages 4 to 12. The blood panel results were highlighted in red chromium hexavalent and cadmium, both running at concentrations 8 times above the safety threshold established by the EPA. Not trace amounts. Not borderline readings. 8 times. "That pattern," she said, pointing to the spike curves on the screen, "is specific to industrial heavy metal discharge. Not agricultural runoff, not residential contamination. This is from a concentrated industrial source, and it has been entering the water supply long enough to accumulate in the tissue of children who drink from municipal lines that draw from the river." She sat down then. "The first cases came in 18 months ago. All of them live along the Neshes corridor between the port and the riverfront district. I filed reports with the Texas Department of State Health Services 3 times. Each one came back insufficient evidence of a specific emission source. I set my notebook on the table and opened it to last night's sketches, the hull layout, the location of the residue, the estimated volume of buildup along the inner casing wall. I placed it next to her laptop. She looked at the drawings for a long time. "Anna, I need a physical sample from inside the discharge source itself," she said. "Not from river water, the dilution makes it inconclusive. From the source directly." "I'm working on access to that," I said. She nodded, studying my diagrams with the focused attention of someone cross-referencing them against something she already knew. Then she opened the desk drawer beside her and took out a single sheet of paper. She placed it on the table between us without comment. 3 names, children. Ages listed beside each one. Cause of death listed beside that acute hepatic failure etiology undetermined. The youngest was 6 years old, a girl. Her home address was on Portside Lane in the Riverfront District. 4 blocks from the Voss Marine Secondary, drainage outlet I had helped design in 1997 and never imagined would be used for anything other than stormwater. She had died 8 months ago. I looked at the list for a long time. I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the list hadn't already said better. I closed my notebook and stood. Mr. Voss. Vivian's voice was quiet, measured the tone of someone choosing words with care. You're not the first person to come to me with a sample. Someone else sat in that chair approximately 2 years ago. He brought me a water specimen collected personally from a specific point on the river. We were supposed to meet again the following week. She paused. He didn't come back. I heard later that he'd had an accident. I stopped at the door. What was his name? I asked. Firadi Kato, she said. Rafferty Cole. The name Rafferty Cole was not a stranger to me. I had known him since he was the youngest diver on the Voss Marine inspection crew, 22 years old, lean and precise, with the kind of confidence underwater that most men take a decade to build. He was the only one on the team who would go down into ballast compartments in under a foot visibility, without being asked twice. I had personally recommended him for the senior certification in 2003. I had not seen him since before the accident. I knew about the accident. The way you know about things that happen to people in your orbit. When you are no longer paying close enough attention, a report filed, a workers' comp claim processed, a name that moved from the active roster to the closed files. I had accepted the explanation. I was given equipment failure depth, disorientation. Unfortunate but not uncommon in commercial diving work. I had not known that Callum was behind it until I stood on the sidewalk outside a ground-floor apartment on Portside Lane and read the name on the buzzer. I knocked once. The door opened to the length of a security chain, then all the way. Rafferty Cole had the wide shoulders of the diver. He used to be the kind of upper body build that comes from years of fighting current and pressure. He was in a wheelchair, both hands resting loose on the push rims, and he looked at me for a long moment with eyes that were sharp in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. I wondered when you'd come, he said, and backed the chair into the room. The apartment was small and clean. A folded wheelchair spare leaned against the wall by the door. In the corner, his old dive gear was stacked with the careful organization of equipment that would never be used again. BCDs, regulators, a pair of fins hung on wall hooks. A framed photo on the shelf showed a younger Rafferty, mid-dive, grinning wide behind his mask, both legs strong and kicking. Beside it, a picture of a girl around 8 years old with his same dark eyes. Lily, I assumed without asking. He told me about 2 years ago without me needing to prompt him. He had been running a routine inspection dive on the underside of a Voss Marine dredging barge, checking hull integrity below the waterline standard certification work. 40 feet down, on the port side aft section, he found a secondary pipe assembly that was not on any technical drawing he had ever been issued. It was bolted to the hull with aftermarket hardware, routed downward at an angle that had one-purpose discharge directly into the river bottom below the sediment line, where current dispersal would distribute whatever came through it across a wide stretch of the niche's floor. He reported it to his supervisor the same afternoon. 1 week later, on his next certification dive, his air supply line had been partially cut. Not severed, that would have been too obvious. Just compromised enough to bleed pressure slowly. Slowly enough that by the time he noticed something was wrong, he was at depth, his breathing was labored, and he lost consciousness before he could reach the ascent line. His dive partner pulled him up in time to keep him alive. The spinal compression from the emergency ascent was permanent. Rafferty opened the top drawer of the side table and placed a USB drive on the surface between us. I filmed the pipe before I reported it, he said. I had a feeling. He looked at the drive. But every attorney in Beaumont I approached took one look at the name Voss Marine and told me they couldn't help. And I ran out of money before I could find someone farther out who could. I looked at the drive, then at him. You have someone now, I said. Callum sold me the Iron Meridian 2 days ago. $50. 30 days to make her leave port under her own power. Rafferty was quiet for a moment. Then something loosened in his face, and he laughed the kind of laugh that comes out of a person who has been holding tension in a specific place for a very long time. He sold you that ship. He thought it was a coffin. He doesn't remember that you taught me how to inspect that vessel in 2003. I sat down in the chair across from him. He told me the rest. After the accident, while he was still in the hospital, a falsified EPA inspection report had been filed and processed, bearing his signature, certifying that all Voss marine discharge systems had been inspected and found compliant. He had never written that report. He had never signed it. But it existed in the federal system under his name, which meant that if he ever tried to come forward with what he knew, the first thing anyone would find was a document suggesting he had already looked and found nothing wrong. Callum had not just broken his spine, he had erased his professional identity and replaced it with a liability. During last year, my daughter asked me why I couldn't stand up, Rafferty said. He was looking at Lily's photo on the shelf. I couldn't answer her. That's the only reason I need to do this. He plugged the USB into his laptop and opened the video file. The underwater footage was murky, the way all low-visibility river diving is visibility under 2 feet, the camera light catching suspended sediment in every frame. But there it was. The secondary pipe assembly gray against the dark hull, bolted in place with hardware that had no business being on a certified vessel. And from the pipe's lower end, a slow, steady flow of deep purple liquid moving downward into the silt. I leaned forward and studied the installation. The fitting work was clean. The routing angle was calculated. Whoever had designed this had understood hull engineering well enough to hide it from a standard above-water inspection. This was done by someone who knew exactly what they were building. I said. That's what I thought, Rafferty said. Which is why I could never understand. Show me the pipe housing again, I said. Pause it there. He froze the frame. I looked at the image for a long time without speaking. Zoom in, I said. Upper fitting, right side. The image enlarged. On the upper collar of the secondary pipe, stamped into the metal rather than stenciled, was a small mark. Not a standard technical designation. Not a manufacturer's code. A stylized letter, curved, deliberate, the kind of mark a person makes when they want something to be found only by the right person. The letter R, formed exactly the way only one person I had ever known chose to write it. There are things an engineer knows that other people simply cannot see. When I designed the Iron Meridian in 1988, I drew every compartment in that vessel by hand. Every bulkhead, every weld line, every inch of interior space accounted for on graph paper before a single piece of steel was cut. I knew this ship the way a man knows the house he built himself, not from memory, but from the bones outward. So when I crawled into the engine room that afternoon and placed both hands flat against the steel, I knew before I had taken a single measurement. This was not the structure I had drawn. The heat inside was brutal. The steel roof had been absorbing Gulf Coast sun for hours, and the compartment held that heat the way an oven holds it after the flame goes out. My NN95 mask turned each breath into effort. I clicked on my headlamp, pulled out the measuring tape, and started at the forward bulkhead. I worked methodically, the way I had always worked, bow to stern, port to starboard, every surface. I was comparing against a blueprint I did not need to look at, because I had drawn it myself, and it had not left me in 35 years. The measurements came back correct through the first 2 bulkheads. At bulkhead 3, I stopped. The distance between bulkhead 3 and bulkhead 4 was 18 inches shorter than it should have been. 18 inches do not disappear from a steel vessel. They go somewhere. I took the small hammer from my belt and ran it along bulkhead 3 in a slow, horizontal line, listening. For the first several feet, the sound was what it should be, the flat, dense ring of solid steel backed by air. Then, at roughly the midpoint of the bulkhead, the tone changed. It went hollow for approximately 2 feet, then a dense again, but a different density. The density of steel with something liquid behind it. I pulled my light in close and examined the surface. The paint was uniform, the same gray-brown as every other surface in the compartment. But the weld seam running the perimeter of a 4-foot rectangular section, near the center, did not match the surrounding metalwork. The rest of the bulkhead had been welded in 1988, or 1989 I could tell by the oxidation pattern and the weld bead profile. The seam around this panel was newer, 20 years newer at minimum, and it was not a patch weld. It was a TIG weld. Tungsten inert gas, the kind used when a joint needs to be airtight. The bead was clean, narrow, and continuous around all 4 edges without a single interruption. Whoever had sealed this panel had not been in a hurry, and they had not been an amateur. This was a hermetic closure, deliberate, engineered, and built to last. I spent 2 hours taking it apart. When the panel finally gave way, a slow pour of deep purple liquid ran across the engine room floor and pooled against the base of the primary pump housing. I stepped back and watched it move. 7 years sealed inside a steel chamber with no oxygen, no microbial activity, no atmospheric moisture to alter its concentration. The heavy metal compound inside was chemically identical to the day it had been pumped in. It was not degraded. It was not diluted. It was preserved. I collected samples in 3 glass vials from my kit, capped each one, labeled them by location, and set them in my duffel. Then I turned to the pump assembly. The primary pump housing opened with a standard wrench. I pulled the access plate on the piston chamber and put my light on the components. Pistons 2 and 4 had deformed contact faces. The metal at the leading edge had bent backward at an angle that told me everything I needed to know. I measured the deflection with my calipers. I ran the calculation in the margin of my notebook. 340 pounds per square inch. That was the pressure required to produce this specific deformation pattern in this grade of steel. Standard bilge water runs at 40 to 60 pounds per square inch. You reach 340 when you are pumping something with the viscosity of heavy industrial sludge, something that resists the pump mechanism the way wet concrete resists a garden hose. The bend in those pistons was permanent. Plastic deformation, when steel yields past its elastic limit, it does not spring back. It stays where the force pushed it. Those pistons would carry the shape of that pressure for as long as they existed, regardless of what ran through the pump afterward. The machine had recorded what it had done, the same way scar tissue records the shape of a wound. I wrote the numbers down and moved my light to the interior of the opened compartment. The hidden chamber was approximately 18 inches deep, running the full width of the bulkhead. The liquid had mostly drained out now, leaving the inner steel walls stained dark purple in long vertical streaks. I held my light against the far wall and looked at the surface closely. Someone had been here before me. Cut into the steel of the inner wall, not scratched, not marked with paint, but engraved with something sharp and deliberate, was a sequence of characters. 12 of them, numbers and letters alternating, spaced evenly, the depth of each cut consistent enough that whoever had made them had taken their time. It was not a technical designation. It was not a manufacturer's code. It had the structure of something meant to be remembered or meant to be found. I photographed it 3 times from different angles, and then I looked at the final character in the sequence. The same stylized R that Rafferty had shown me on his underwater footage the day before. The same curve, the same deliberate hand. Not stamped, carved. Made by someone standing exactly where I was standing now, in this same dark, chemical-heavy air, with a tool and enough time and a reason I was only beginning to understand. I stood straight in the low space and held the light steady on that last character for a long moment. Rosalind had not simply known about what Callum was doing. She had been here. She had stood in this compartment, breathed this air, and left something behind, not for anyone, but for me specifically, because no one else would have known to look for the missing 18 inches. The sequence on that wall was not random. It was a message with a lock on it, and I already knew who held the key. Rosalind died 3 years ago. Liver cancer, aggressive, fast-moving, the kind that gives you no negotiating room. I sat beside her through every treatment and believed what the doctors told me about causation because I had no reason to question it. A man does not go looking for a different explanation when the one he has comes with laboratory reports and clinical language and the tired eyes of people who have delivered this news before. I believed them until that night. Until I was sitting in the dark cabin of the Iron Meridian with my wife's initial carved into the wall of a hidden steel compartment, and I began doing the arithmetic I should have done 3 years earlier. The 12 characters from the hidden compartment were coordinates I had recognized the structure within the first hour. A reference system I had designed into this vessel myself, bulkhead number, offset from the bow elevation from the deck floor. 3 clusters of 4 each defining one axis. Translated, they pointed to a single location forward storage port, side 4 feet from the bow, 18 inches above the floor. The forward storage wall had a teak panel, a 6-inch strip of fine-grained hardwood, with no practical reason to exist on a working river barge. I removed it with a flathead screwdriver. Behind it was a small stainless steel recess, sealed at every edge with a continuous TG weld, airtight, built to last longer than whoever built it. Inside, a small red velvet pouch containing 7 copper coins, each with a laser-etched barcode on the reverse. Beneath it, a note card in handwriting I would have known anywhere. Place in secondary shaft number 2. Press auxiliary start. R. The secondary shaft was a resonance testing mechanism I had engineered into the engine room in 1989, a minor component I had not thought about in 20 years. I found it, cleared the debris from the housing, and seated the first coin in the rotation collar the way the note described. I pressed the auxiliary start. The shaft turned, and from a small speaker recessed into the engine room bulkhead, one I had not noticed and would never have searched for, my wife's voice came through. She had recorded it in a quiet room with the composed tone of a woman who had decided exactly what she needed to say and was not going to waste words getting there. She told me she had discovered the truth 4 years before she died, a chemical disposal billing document Callum had left on the dining room table, the kind of careless mistake that men who believe themselves untouchable make without thinking. She had not confronted him. She had investigated alone over months, building a picture of what he had been doing and how long it had been going on. Then she told me why she had said nothing. At that point, Callum controlled the board completely, she said. You had no physical evidence, only my word. If you had moved against him, then he would have closed everything down before you had a foundation to stand on. I needed to wait until he was most certain of himself, until he believed he had already won. A pause. I could hear her breathing, slow, deliberate, the way she breathed in the last year when drawing air required effort. That moment was always going to be the moment he handed you something he thought was worthless. She finished the way she finished most things, without sentimentality, but with precision. You built ships that crossed oceans. This one doesn't need to cross anything. It only needs to leave the dock. The shaft completed its rotation. The speaker went quiet. I sat on the engine room floor with the flashlight off for a long time after that. The chemical smell was still present. The niches worked against the hull outside with the same patience it had always had. I did not move until the first gray light came through the broken cabin window above me. Barnaby Wells opened his office door on my first knock, already dressed. When he looked at my face, he said without any introduction, "You found the recording." His office was on the 3rd floor of a red brick building on Calder Avenue, A room that smelled of legal volumes and old wood and the particular quiet of a space where serious things had been decided without fanfare for a long time. He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me. He read Clause 7B from the contract copy he had on file. The seller assumes full legal and financial liability for all environmental violations arising from the operational history of the asset throughout the duration of the seller's ownership period. He set the page down. Callum signed a standard Voss Marine asset disposition form, the same template used to offload decommissioned equipment. He had signed dozens without reading past the first page. The clause was on page 2, written in language consistent with the surrounding boilerplate. Barnaby looked at me steadily. His certainty that you were finished is what made it work. He placed a thick folder on the desk between us. 4 years of documents in Rosalind's handwriting, billing receipts, internal correspondence photographs she had taken herself at the shipyard, printed and dated and organized with the care of someone building something meant to survive her. She had done all of it alone, while she was ill. While I sat across from her at the same dining table where she had found the document that started everything and knew nothing. She told me she was not afraid of dying, Barnaby said. She was only afraid of dying before she had finished preparing you. I looked at her handwriting on the notes clipped inside the folder. The same unhurried script she had used for 40 years. I stood and picked up the folder. Sterling. His voice stopped me at the door. There is one more document in that file. Rosalind instructed me to hold it until you were calm enough to process what it says, not angry. She was specific about that. Does it concern Callum? I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. The look of a man who has been carrying something for 3 years and is not yet certain this is the right morning to set it down. It concerns where Callum comes from, he said. Before I tell you what Barnaby read aloud that morning, the one thing Sterling never saw coming in 40 years, drop a comment with the number 7, so I know you're still here with me. Because what comes next changes everything you thought you understood about this family. Note: some scenes in this story are fictional, added to bring the message to life. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, this is a good place to stop. I slept 2 hours on the forward cabin floor with Rosalind's folder under my arm. When I walked back into Barnaby's office the following morning, I told myself I was ready for whatever the last document contained. I had already processed the recording. I had already stood in the dark of a ship my wife had quietly turned into a trap while she was dying. I believed I had reached the bottom of what this week could ask of me. I was wrong about that. Barnaby was waiting. The coffee was already poured and already going cold, the kind of morning where neither of us had thought about temperature. He opened the folder without preamble, the way a doctor opens a chart when the conversation has moved past the point of preparation. He read Rosalind's letter aloud. She had written it by hand on the same cream-colored notepaper she had used for 40 years. She was precise, and she did not apologize, which was consistent with everything I had known about her. She told me that in 1991, during the 6 weeks, we had separated, a period neither of us had spoken about since the morning we decided to put it behind us. She had been briefly involved with someone else. When she discovered she was pregnant, she did not know with certainty whose child it was. She made a choice. She told me what she told me, and she watched me fall in love with that infant before he had been home a week. And she decided that the truth would do nothing except damage something that was already, by every observable measure, real. She wrote that she had carried it alone for 32 years. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that she believed she had been right at the time, and that she was no longer certain of that. Barnaby lowered the letter. I did not speak immediately. I sat with the information. The way you sit with structural damage. You look at it. You assess the load it's carrying. You determine what has actually failed and what is still standing. Barnaby told me the rest of what Rosalind had written, the part about Callum, At 27, in an impulsive moment after a night of drinking with colleagues, he had ordered a consumer DNA kit and used it. The results came back within 2 weeks. He had never said a word to anyone. But from that point forward, everything had changed in him, not visibly, not in any way that announced itself, but in the way a load-bearing wall changes when something unseen shifts inside it. Every achievement Callum built inside Voss Marine became evidence in his own mind that he was an imposter occupying a throne that had been built by someone else's hands. Every time he sat in a boardroom meeting and looked across the table at me, at the calloused hands and the flannel shirt, and the man who had designed the ships this company was built on, he was looking at the living proof of what he was not. He did not destroy me because he hated me. He destroyed me because he could not tolerate what he saw in himself every time he looked at me. I stood up and went to the window. The street below was ordinary. A Beaumont Tuesday morning traffic moving a delivery truck double-parked outside the hardware store across the street. I watched it for a moment. I thought about a morning in 1992 when Callum was 3 years old, and I lifted him onto my shoulders, on the dock, and he put both hands flat on top of my head and laughed at being taller than everything. I thought about the night he was 4 and had pneumonia, and I sat next to his hospital bed for 3 nights without going home because I could not make myself leave. I thought about the afternoon he was 15 and laid his first clean weld bead on a practice plate in my workshop, and I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Good job," when what I actually felt was something I could not have named out loud without embarrassing us both. I turned back from the window. "I changed his diapers," I said. My voice came out level, which surprised me. I sat next to his hospital bed for 3 nights when he was 4 years old. I taught him how to read a technical drawing before he could read a sentence. Blood doesn't make those things. 40 years makes those things. And 40 years cannot be undone by a piece of paper from a mail-order DNA kit. Barnaby looked at me for a moment. He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he has been hoping to hear a specific thing and has just heard it. I picked up Rosalind's folder from the desk, shook his hand, and walked out. The morning air outside was already thick with Gulf Coast heat, the kind that settles on your shoulders like a second shirt before 9 in the morning. I was halfway down Calder Avenue, moving toward the waterfront, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. "Unknown number," I answered. The voice was young and fast and precise, the voice of someone accustomed to getting to the point before the other person decides to hang up. "Mr. Voss, my name is Cordelia Marsh. I'm an investigative reporter with the Houston Chronicle. I've been tracking Voss Marine Industries for 6 months." A brief pause, not hesitation, just breath. "I received information this morning that Callum Voss is preparing to move all internal corporate documents off-site within the next 48 hours. I stopped walking. "What kind of documents?" I asked. "The kind that don't survive a due diligence audit," she said. I looked up the street toward the water. The top of the Voss Marine building was visible above the roof lines. From here, the same building I had walked out of 4 days ago, with a $50 contract in my chest pocket. 23 days remained on the clock. I had evidence in a folder under my arm, 3 glass vials in my duffel, a USB drive with underwater footage, and a newspaper reporter on the phone telling me that Callum had just started moving faster. I started walking again, quicker this time. The anchor and rail had been part of my routine for as long as I could remember. Not for the beer I rarely drank before evening, but for the particular quality of the place at 4 in the afternoon. The light coming low and amber through the salt-fogged windows. The bar quiet between the lunch crowd and the dinner shift. The smell of old wood and fry oil and the kind of coffee that has been sitting on a burner since morning and tastes exactly like what it is. I had spent hundreds of Tuesday mornings in that corner booth over 40 years. It was the kind of place where men who worked with their hands talked about the work without having to explain what any of it meant. That afternoon, I spread everything I had across the table. They arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Vivian with a medical file under one arm, and the expression of someone who had rearranged a full afternoon to be here. Rafferty rolling in from the side entrance that had the wider doorway. Gideon last sitting down with the deliberate weight of a man who has made a decision and is no longer debating it. 4 cups of coffee. 4 people who had all in different ways been waiting for this table. I started from the beginning and did not leave anything out. The hidden compartment. The hermetic weld. The purple residue and the 3 sample vials now sitting in Vivian's hospital refrigerator. Rosalind's recording and what she had said about waiting for the right moment. Clause 7b and what Barnaby had explained about its scope. And then the phone call from Cordelia Marsh that morning, Callum moving documents off-site within 48 hours. When I finished, Rafferty plugged the USB into the laptop he had brought and turned the screen so all of us could see. The underwater footage ran for 4 minutes. The secondary pipe assembly was clear enough. The gray fittings against the dark hull, the deliberate routing angle, the slow, purple discharge moving downward into the river silt. Vivian watched the entire thing without speaking. When it ended, she opened her medical file and placed a blood panel result on the table beside the laptop. Chromium hexavalent, she said, pointing to the spike on the graph. Same compound. The concentration curve in this child's blood work matches what a sustained low-volume discharge would produce over 14 to 18 months of exposure through municipal water intake. She paused. This is not circumstantial. Gideon had been quiet through all of it. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the center of the table. Callum has called me 3 times this week, he said. Each call, the number went up. He started at $20,000 to deny Sterling Dock access when the 30 days expire. By the 3rd call, it was 60. He looked at me. He's building a backup. He's worried. We divided the work, the way you divide a repair job by who knows what, not by what's convenient. Vivian would continue gathering medical documentation and file a formal complaint with the EPA's regional office through official channels, simultaneously preparing the paperwork for a court subpoena of Rosalind's autopsy records. Rafferty would run the technical analysis on the pipe assembly footage and begin rigging the specialized dive equipment he would need for the underwater work ahead. Gideon would continue answering Callum's calls, behaving as normal, and report anything that indicated a change in timeline or tactics. I would stay on the ship, continue the mechanical repairs, and collect whatever physical evidence the vessel still had to give. I called Cordelia from the table, no introductions needed. She picked up on the first ring. I told her I was willing to share documentation on a timed basis. Nothing would be published until I gave explicit clearance. She agreed without argument, which told me she had been expecting exactly those terms. Rafferty unfolded the Neches River navigation chart he had brought and laid it flat over the other papers. He had marked 7 points along the river corridor between the port and the riverfront district, calculated from the current pattern. The known mooring positions of Voss Marine dredging barges over the past 5 years, and the discharge angle visible in his footage. Vivian opened her patient file to the address page. She read out the home address of each of the 14 children currently under her care. Rafferty pointed to a location on the map for each one. By the 5th address, nobody was talking. By the 10th, the table was completely silent. Every address fell within a quarter mile of a marked discharge point. The correlation was not approximate. It was exact. Rafferty looked at the map for a moment, then looked across the table at Vivian. How many children? 14 in active treatment, she said. 3 who didn't make it. He looked down at his hands on the push rims of his wheelchair hands that had spent 19 years reading submerged steel in zero visibility and had not forgotten how. Gideon looked at me. I looked at the map. The afternoon light came through the fogged glass and sat on the table between us, and nobody spoke for a long time. There was nothing that needed to be said. We settled the bill and gathered the papers. I was pulling on my jacket when Gideon touched my arm. "There's something I didn't mention inside," he said quietly. We were standing near the door, the others still at the table behind us. Callum's had someone watching Dock 7 since yesterday, not port staff outside hire. Black SUV parked at the far end of the pier. I've seen them there both mornings. "He's nervous," I said. "Sterling." Gideon's voice dropped another register. "They have infrared cameras." I knew Callum was watching me. It did not trouble me the way he intended it to. I had taught him as a boy that the best observer is not the one who sees the most. It is the one who controls what others are allowed to see. He had apparently forgotten that lesson, or perhaps he had never understood it was a lesson at all. I had 2 days to prepare. I used them. The auxiliary boiler was in the lower engine room, bolted to the port side bulkhead behind the primary pump housing. I had designed it in 1989 as a heating system for the crew quarters, steam-fed. Simple, the kind of redundant system that gets ignored for decades because nothing about it ever fails dramatically enough to require attention. The maintenance logs showed it had last been serviced in 2004. When I bled the pressure line and checked the firebox, I found it in better condition than the rest of the engine room combined. Some machinery simply waits. I spent the better part of 2 days cleaning the burner assembly, testing the steam valves, and verifying the output pressure at each of the 4 hull side release vents. They were positioned along the waterline on both beams, designed to exhaust excess steam away from the deck. In normal operation, they produced a thin white vapor that dissipated in seconds. With the output valves opened fully and the boiler running at sustained pressure, they would produce something considerably more substantial. The reflective powder was industrial-grade retroreflective material, the same compound used in highway signage and safety markings. I sourced it from a marine supply warehouse on the north side of Beaumont, paid cash, and mixed it into the boiler's water reservoir, at a ratio I had calculated to produce the right particle density in the steam output. The principle was straightforward. Infrared cameras operate by reading heat signatures, but retroreflective particles return the camera's own IR emission directly back to the sensor. The result is not darkness on the screen, it is whiteout. The camera sees nothing but its own light amplified and reflected back at full intensity. At 10 o'clock on Saturday night, the 7th day since I had stepped onto this ship, I went below and lit the boiler. It took 12 minutes to reach operating pressure, longer than the original specs, but the system held. I opened the hull vents in sequence, port, side first, then starboard. The steam came out low and white and thick, rolling across the deck and spilling off the gunnels onto the water's surface. Within 5 minutes, the entire vessel was wrapped in a moving white layer that sat at deck height and drifted outward in a slow radius across the dock. Rafferty's voice came through the handheld radio from his position on the elevated walkway 300 meters north. "Camera operators are moving. 1 person out of the vehicle." I was already below, working in the engine room by feel and headlamp. The infrared feed from the SUV was showing them nothing but reflected light white noise where there should have been a thermal image of a man moving around a ship. I packaged the 12 priority samples. In the lead-lined case, I had prepared the 3 vials from the hidden compartment, 4 sediment samples from the bilge, 2 swabs from the secondary pipe residue Rafferty had identified, and 3 cross-sections of the crystalline hull buildup. I sealed the case, attached the line I had pre-rigged to the starboard stern cleat, and lowered it over the side into the water at 11:45. "Package is in the water," I said into the radio. Rafferty relayed to Vivian. 3 minutes later, "She has it. Moving." I climbed back to the main deck and went into the cabin. I sat down in the chair I had positioned near the broken window, opened the book I had left there that morning, and read 4 pages while the boiler ran through its remaining pressure and the fog thinned gradually with the night air. At 2 in the morning, I closed the book, turned off my headlamp, and went to sleep on the cabin floor. Rafferty called at 6:15. He told me what he had seen during the panic in the SUV, the person in the driver's seat, making repeated phone calls over a 40-minute period while the fog was running. At one point, stepping out of the vehicle and walking 20 feet toward the dock before stopping. Rafferty had the telephoto lens on the SUV's interior for most of that time. When the interior light came on as the door opened, he had a clear line of sight to the phone screen. The number on the outgoing call display was a Beaumont area code, an office exchange that Rafferty had then run through the Voss Marine corporate directory he had retained from his inspection work. Years ago, it was not a private security contractor. It was not a hired observer from an outside firm. The number belonged to the direct line of Callum's personal office at Voss Marine Industries headquarters, 12th floor. The person in the vehicle was Pemberton Cross. I held the radio and looked at the meshes through the broken cabin window. The morning river was flat and pale green in the early light, moving south toward the Gulf without any particular urgency. A pelican was working the shallows along the far bank. The port was just beginning its morning shift, the low diesel thrum of machinery starting up in the distance. The first horn of the day from somewhere up the channel. Pemberton had not hired anyone. Callum had sent his own board member to sit in a parking lot with a camera, which meant either Callum did not trust anyone outside his immediate circle with this assignment, or there was no one left in that circle he could use. Either way, the panic from last night had a cost. Callum was going to spend today reassessing. That gave me a window, not a wide one, but real, before he recalibrated and started making moves that were harder to anticipate. The next step had been waiting since before the board meeting, since before the contract and the $50 and the 30-day clock. It was something that required a particular kind of authority, federal independent, and with the technical background, to understand what the evidence actually meant. I picked up the phone and found the number I had written in the back margin of my notebook 4 days ago. Beaumont Hale had been waiting for this call longer than I had. 40 years of designing marine engines taught me one thing above everything else: steel does not lie. It deforms exactly according to the force applied to it, no more, no less, and never in a direction the physics did not require. Every bend, every fracture, every surface irregularity is a record. If you know how to read it, metal will tell you precisely what happened to it, and when and under what conditions. It cannot be coached. It cannot be revised after the fact. It simply holds the shape of what was done to it and waits for someone to ask. That morning, I taught Beaumont Hale how to ask. I had the pump housing open before 7. The access plate removed both deformed pistons, photographed from 4 angles each, with a measuring reference in frame. I set the phone on the valve housing with the camera facing the open assembly and dialed the EPA regional office in Houston. Beaumont Hale picked up on the second ring. He was a compact man in his early 50s, gray at the temples, with the deliberate manner of someone who had spent a career being careful about what he said in official contexts. He had a notepad in front of him and a coffee cup he did not touch during the entire call. He looked at the screen the way an experienced investigator looks at evidence without expression. Processing. I started from the engineering. This pump was designed to operate at a maximum of 180 psi under standard seawater load, I said. I held the first photograph up to the camera, then sent it to the email address he had given me. Pistons 2 and 4 have contact face deformation in a single consistent direction. I measured the deflection angle this morning. Working backward through the deformation equations for this steel grade, the pressure required to produce this specific bend pattern is 340 pounds per square inch. Beaumont wrote something on his pad. What produces that kind of differential? of fluid with viscosity approximately 3 times that of seawater. Heavy industrial sludge. The pump was used to move something it was never designed to move. At pressure levels the components couldn't sustain without permanent damage. He looked up from the pad. Mr. Voss, this vessel has been sitting decommissioned for 7 years. Could this be consistent with age-related mechanical failure? It was the right question. I had expected it. No, I said. For 2 specific reasons. I brought the second photograph up. Age-related fatigue produces deformation that is gradual. Distributed across the contact surface in multiple directions, the metal yields along its weakest grain lines, which run in several orientations. What I am looking at is unidirectional deformation. Both pistons bent the same way, at the same face location, to a degree consistent with a single sustained overpressure event, rather than cumulative stress over time. I set the photograph down. The second reason is more fundamental. Plastic deformation in steel is permanent. When metal is stressed past its elastic limit, it does not recover. It holds the shape it was pushed into, regardless of what happens afterward, whether the pump runs water or runs nothing at all for 7 years. These pistons are not showing me their current condition. They are showing me their history. And I designed this pump. I know exactly how it was supposed to fail with age. This is not that. Beaumont was quiet for a moment. He wrote several lines without speaking. Vivian joined the call at the 40-minute mark, her camera coming on from what looked like a hospital conference room. She shared her screen a comparative table showing heavy metal concentration readings at each of the 7 river points Rafferty had mapped against the blood panel results from her 14 active patients. The correlation coefficient across the dataset was 94%. She walked Beaumont through the methodology in the same precise, unhurried tone she had used with me in the hospital. He asked 3 technical questions. She answered each one without consulting notes. When she finished, Beaumont leaned back in his chair for the first time in the call. "I need to meet with you in person," he said. "Both of you. And I need the physical samples transferred to our regional laboratory under chain of custody protocol." He paused. "There is something you should both know." He turned a page on his notepad. The EPA opened a preliminary investigation into Voss marine discharge practices 14 months ago, based on anomalous water quality readings from a monitoring station near the riverfront intake. That investigation was suspended after a Voss Marine legal representative presented a clean internal inspection report to the regional director. The report was signed by the lead inspector of record. He looked at me through the screen. The name on that report was Rafferty Cole. The room was quiet for a moment. "Rafferty Cole has been in a wheelchair since an accident 2 years ago," I said. "He did not write that report. He did not sign it." Beaumont looked at the folder in front of him. He looked at it for long enough that I could see him running through the implications in sequence. The way a careful man works through a problem he did not expect to find at this size. He looked back at the camera. "Mr. Voss, if what you're telling me is accurate, Callum Voss did not only discharge prohibited industrial waste into a navigable waterway, he actively obstructed a federal environmental investigation by submitting falsified documentation to a federal agency." He paused. "Shatiku. That is a separate federal criminal offense under 18 U.S.C. 1001. It carries its own sentencing exposure entirely independent of the environmental violations." I nodded. "It also," Beaumont said, "explains why the regional director accepted the report without further verification. He had no reason to question the signature of the inspector of record." I ended the call 20 minutes later and sat in the engine room with the phone in my hand. Callum had not simply injured Rafferty to silence a witness. He had converted Rafferty's professional identity into a shield, a forged document bearing a real name from a credentialed inspector. Delivered at the precise moment a federal investigation was gaining traction. It was not improvised. It required access to Rafferty's certification records knowledge of the EPA process and enough lead time to execute before the investigation reached the point of no return. He had been very thorough, very careful. But thorough and careful people still leave things behind. Rafferty's footage showed the pipe assembly from above the sediment line. What it did not show, what no one had retrieved yet, was what the pipe had deposited directly into the river bottom over the years it had been running. That evidence was still down there, sitting in the silt, waiting. I asked Rafferty one time, "Are you certain about this?" He looked at me. Then he looked down at his legs resting motionless on the wheelchair footrests, and then back at me. "I've been thinking about this since the day I left the hospital," he said. "I just needed someone to trust me enough to ask." That was the end of the conversation about whether. On the 11th day, Callum called Rafferty. I heard the details secondhand 20 minutes after it happened, when Rafferty phoned me from his apartment. The call had been brief and cold, the kind of cold that is practiced rather than felt. Callum informed him that effective immediately, his disability compensation payments through the Voss Marine Insurance Fund were being suspended, pending an internal audit review. The audit, Callum explained, had identified irregularities in the original claim documentation. The suspension was indefinite. There was, however, a way to resolve the matter quickly. If Rafferty could provide access to the Iron Meridian's hull underside and compromise the structural integrity of the new reinforcement work, the audit would find no irregularities. Rafferty had listened to the entire offer without speaking. Then he had hung up and called me. We spent the rest of that day building what he needed. The support frame was fabricated from aluminum tube stock I sourced from the marine supply warehouse, the same place I had bought the reflective powder. A mounting bracket bolted to the wheelchair frame allowed the dive rig to attach and detach in under 2 minutes. The buoyancy compensator was a standard BCD modified with an additional low-pressure inflator that Rafferty could operate entirely with his right hand. 2 tanks, manifolded together for extended bottom time. He would navigate with his arms and torso the way competitive swimmers with lower body disabilities do, using his upper body for directional control and trusting the buoyancy system to manage depth. He had been a professional diver for 19 years before the accident. His lungs, his shoulders, his spatial orientation underwater, none of that had changed. Only the propulsion mechanism. We ran a shallow water test off the stern ladder at 11 in the evening. Gideon, watching from the dock, approached with a radio. Rafferty went under for 8 minutes, surfaced, adjusted the BCD trim, went under again. On the 3rd submersion, he stayed down for 22 minutes. When he came up, he said nothing, just gave me a thumbs up and handed me the empty sample bag to reload. At midnight, he went down for the work dive. The aluminum titanium alloy panels were staged on the stern deck in order of installation sequence, 6 panels, each 8 pounds, each pre-drilled for the fastener pattern I had designed to interface with the existing hull frame. The alloy was the same class used in commercial submarine hull reinforcement, light enough that a single person could handle each panel underwater without mechanical assistance, strong enough to create an effective secondary shell. Between the original hull surface and the new panel face, a sealed air chamber approximately 4 inches deep would run the length of the installation. 6 panels, 6 chambers. The combined volume sufficient to add meaningful positive buoyancy without any change to the vessel's external profile. This was not patching. It was an engineered modification, one that made the hull stronger, the vessel more seaworthy, and the displacement more favorable, all without adding the kind of weight that would defeat the purpose. Rafferty was underwater for 40 minutes. I tracked his position by the line I had rigged from the stern cleat, a thin guide rope he could follow back to the ladder in 0 visibility. The Neshez at midnight was exactly what it always was, black cold at depth, moving with the slow indifference of a river that has been here longer than anything built on its banks. I stood on the stern deck and watched the line, and did not allow myself to think about what 40 feet of dark water does to a man who has not been in it for 2 years. He came up at 12:40. I heard him before I saw him, the controlled exhale of a diver surfacing with air to spare the sound of a man who remembered exactly what he was doing. He found the ladder and climbed it entirely with his arms, one rung at a time, pulling his weight up the side of the hull until he could get a knee onto the deck. I did not offer a hand. He had not asked for one. He sat on the deck boards and pulled off his mask. His eyes were red, not from the river water, which he would have sealed out, but from something internal, something that had been pressing from the inside for 2 years and had just been given somewhere to go. I handed him a towel and sat down beside him and did not say anything. After a while, he said, "I forgot what it felt like, being in the water. I thought I was afraid of it permanently." "Were you afraid tonight?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "But I went down anyway." We sat with that for a moment. Gideon's flashlight moved at the end of the dock, the slow sweep of a man doing his job. Rafferty reached into the mesh bag clipped to his BCD and placed something on the deck between us. It was a valve, a gate valve, industrial-grade steel construction, larger than any fitting that belonged on the Iron Meridian. It was heavily corroded, river bottom corroded. The kind of oxidation that takes years of submersion to develop. One side of the flange had been cut cleanly, not broken cut with a tool, deliberately separated from whatever assembly it had been part of. The serial number plate on the body was still legible. Schatten. That was sitting in the silt 12 feet from the discharge pipe outlet, Rafferty said. He was looking at it with the focused attention of a man who had spent years reading submerged hardware. I recognized the product line as soon as I touched it. That valve series was only installed on one class of Voss marine vessel. He looked at me. It came off the Meridian Star, the barge Voss Marine decommissioned and sold for scrap 3 years ago. I picked up the valve and held it under my headlamp. The serial number was consistent with the Meridian Star's construction year and equipment specifications. I knew the vessel well enough to know that. If Callum had removed this valve from the Meridian Star before decommissioning and disposed of it in the river, there was one reason to do it. He did not want anyone to know that vessel had been fitted with the same secondary pipe assembly. He had not been covering the tracks of one ship. He had been covering the tracks of a fleet. On the 14th day, I started painting the ship. In the middle of the day, in full view of the dock, the Port Authority camera at the end of the pier, and whatever eyes Callum had pointed in my direction from across the water, I wanted him to see it. I wanted the report to reach him within the hour. The old man is painting the hull white, trying to make the condemned vessel look seaworthy before the clock runs out. I wanted him to find that information amusing. Amusement produces inattention, and inattention was the only resource I needed from Callum at this particular stage of the work. From what Gideon reported back the following morning, that was exactly what Callum thought. The pH indicator compound had arrived by freight truck from a Houston chemical supplier on the morning of the 14th industrial grade, the same reactive coding class used in wastewater treatment monitoring and environmental remediation work. The underlying chemistry required no exotic conditions to operate. In a neutral or mildly alkaline environment, the compound held its base color without visible change. In the presence of dissolved heavy metals, specifically the chromium and cadmium signature of industrial electroplating and surface treatment discharge, it underwent a rapid color shift to deep red. Not a suggestion of red, not a tint that required a laboratory to confirm. A saturated, unambiguous red that a man standing on the far bank of the Neches could identify without equipment. I spent 2 evenings calculating the mix ratio before touching the hull. Too high a concentration, and the color might shift from humidity alone, producing a false result that would undermine the evidential value of any genuine reaction. Too low, and the response time would extend past the window I was working with. The target was a clear reaction within 4 minutes of contact, using a compound that looked indistinguishable from standard white hull primer in every application condition in the can, on the brush and on the dried surface. Anyone watching me work those 2 days would see a 68-year-old man in work clothes applying white paint to a weathered steel hull with a roller and a brush. That was the complete picture as far as any observer was concerned. That was what I needed it to be. Cordelia arrived at the dock on the morning of the 15th. I had given her a time and a general location, and nothing else. She came with a camera bag over one shoulder, and the unhurried manner of someone who had done this kind of work long enough to know that the most important discipline is not appearing to be doing anything in particular. Mid-30s, dark hair clothes that were practical without being conspicuous. The kind of field gear a working photographer wears in any port waterfront or industrial location where standing out means losing access. She did not approach me or acknowledge my presence. She set up near a dock bollard on the adjacent pier and spent the morning shooting the river traffic. The crane arms, the tugboats working the channel. Standard behavior. Nobody on the dock looked at her twice, which was the precise outcome both of us needed. I painted the river-facing beam from bow to stern that day and let it cure overnight. Gideon called at 7 on the morning of the 16th. The new Meridian Callum's primary operational tug, reflagged under the new Voss Marine branding 2 years ago, was scheduled for a ballast water exchange transit past Dock 7 at 2 that afternoon. The vessel ran this particular route semi-regularly. The channel between the commercial dock face and the older berths was a convenient stretch for the brief ballast discharge that port-adjacent vessels perform to manage tank levels during operations. The crew would open the port-side discharge valves for a short period while underway. Standard procedure. Nothing that would attract attention. I checked the wind out of habit, confirmed the surface current direction with Gideon, and called Cordelia. At 2 o'clock, I was on the forward deck with a paint roller working a section near the bow when the new Meridian came around the channel bend at half ahead. She was riding low, a working vessel carrying operational load with the Voss Marine markings crisp on her superstructure in the flat afternoon light. I kept the roller moving and did not look up. The ballast discharge opened as she drew level with Dock 7. The outflow came off her port side in the standard low-pressure wash, grayish-green water from a tank that had been sitting in this river through weeks of operations, carrying the accumulated chemistry of wherever this vessel had been and whatever had been run through her systems. It spread across the surface between the two hulls, in the way discharge water always spreads outward and slightly downstream, with the current finding contact with surrounding surfaces, reaching the freshly painted beam of the iron Meridian within 90 seconds of hitting the water. I kept the roller moving. The reaction began at the waterline, where the contact concentration was highest, and worked upward as the contaminated water wickered against the paint surface. I had calculated 4 minutes for a clear result. The actual elapsed time was 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I watched it from the corner of my eye without stopping work, and I counted every second of it. The river-facing beam shifted from white to red in uneven blooms, starting at the waterline and spreading upward along the hull plates as the reactive compound responded to the heavy metals in the water. The blooms expanded and merged as the reaction propagated across the surface. By the 4-minute mark, the entire painted face of the hull looking toward the river had turned the deep, saturated color of oxidized iron, visible from the far bank, visible from the Port Authority building at the head of the pier, visible to every person on Dock 7 who happened to be looking south. 3 dock workers stopped moving. 2 fishermen on a vessel moored 2 berths north stood up from their rigging and looked across the water without speaking. A Port Authority truck that had been idling at the pier entrance rolled slowly forward, the driver's window coming down. Cordelia did not move from her position. She shot continuously for 11 minutes. I looked up when the new meridian was already past the midpoint of the dock face. Callum was on the bridge wing. He was standing at the rail with one hand on the bridge housing, watching the iron meridian's hull change color in front of him. I had not seen his face clearly since the boardroom on the first morning. The distance and the river haze made precise expression unreadable. But I did not need to read his expression. I could read his posture. And his posture said what posture always says when a man has built a certainty over 2 weeks of planning and is watching it come apart in real time in front of witnesses he cannot remove. Certainty has a specific physical quality when it is present. It has an equally specific quality when it leaves. He spoke to the crewman beside him. The new Meridian's engines went to full ahead. She cleared the dock area in under 2 minutes and did not slow down until she was well past the channel bend. The hull of the iron Meridian stayed red for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening when the light finally made it harder to see. The chemistry did not reverse. The evidence did not fade. It dried into the primer and held. That night, Cordelia sent me the full photograph set with a short message attached. She had everything she needed to publish. She would hold until I gave the word she had agreed to my timeline, and she was respecting it. But I should know. Someone had come to the Houston Chronicle's front desk that morning asking questions about her. Not a reader. Not an advertiser. Nobody the front desk staff could place. They had asked about her recent assignment history and left without providing a name or contact information. I called Barnaby before I set the phone down. 12 days left on the contract. Callum had watched his own vessel's discharge turn his father's hull red in front of dock workers, fishermen, and a port authority driver, and he had understood in that moment, standing on the bridge wing with the Neshes between them, that the evidence had moved beyond the interior of a ship and into the visible world. It was on film. It had witnesses. And he had begun in the hours since to reach toward the people who had helped put it there. Callum grew up with computers. He learned to trust systems that ran on code algorithms, data feeds, automated responses to automated inputs. He had studied this in London and come back to Beaumont with a particular confidence in anything digital, a confidence that expressed itself as a quiet contempt for anything that wasn't. I had watched it develop in him over the years, without fully understanding what it would eventually cost him. I grew up with pulleys and leverage ratios and Newton's laws written in chalk on a shipyard blackboard. When Callum reached into my ship through a digital connection and began moving things I had not authorized, I did not fight him on his ground. I pulled the plug, picked up a wrench, and went back to working the way I had worked before he was born. On the morning of the 17th day, the navigation display on the bridge showed the iron meridian underway at 4 knots bearing northeast in the middle of the Neches Channel. The ship had not moved. I checked the GPS receiver, the AIS transponder, and the autopilot interface in sequence. The position data being broadcast to the Port Authority monitoring system showed a vessel actively transiting the river, a ghost track injected into the electronics upstream of the display, clean enough to pass a casual system check. Whoever had done it knew maritime navigation systems. The intrusion had not tripped any of the standard fault alerts. I powered down everything connected to an external network and went below to the control wiring trunk. It took most of the 17th and all of the 18th day to strip the electronics out completely. The GPS antenna and receiver came out first, then the AIS unit, then the digital compass module, and the automated bilge monitoring sensors, anything with a network interface or a remote accessible firmware layer. I pulled the wiring harnesses and capped every terminal in the panel. When I was finished, the navigation station looked the way navigation stations looked in 1974. That was the condition I wanted. In their place, a rope and pulley steering linkage running from the helm station aft to the rudder quadrant, built from galvanized steel cable and bronze sheaves I had sourced from the salvage inventory at the back of Gideon's dock warehouse. The mechanical advantage was calculated for single-person operation at the helm enough force multiplication that I could hold a course against moderate river current without assistance. A magnetic compass in a gimbaled brass housing was mounted to the forward window frame, the same type used on workboats throughout the Gulf Coast for the better part of a century. Whistle and light signals for channel communication per the inland navigation rules that had not changed in 30 years. Rafferty ran the numbers from his apartment that evening. With the manual system assuming a competent helmsman and standard niches channel markers for reference, the Iron Meridian could maintain course within 2 degrees of intended heading, more than adequate for a river transit of this length. "It's slower to respond than power steering," Rafferty said through the phone. "Everything worthwhile is slower than the alternative," I said. Gideon called at 9 o'clock on the evening of the 19th. He had been in the Port Authority Administrative Office that afternoon for a routine dock renewal meeting. On the board behind the duty manager's desk, the scheduling board where berth assignments and departure notices were posted, he had seen a new notation added to the Dock 7 entry. Berth closure order signed by the Port Operations Director. Effective date day 28 of the current month. Time 6 in the morning. Any vessel remaining in the berth at that time would be subject to mandatory tow removal at the owner's expense. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat down at the chart table with a pencil and the tide tables for the lower niches. 9 days. The list of remaining work had 2 items on it, both large, the ballast removal and buoyancy modification, and the main engine rebuild. The engine was the longer job by a significant margin. I had known that since the first night aboard. 9 days was tighter than I had planned for. Not impossible, but it required a specific sequencing, and it required the buoyancy work to go exactly right. I ran the calculations I had been putting off. The Iron Meridian's current displacement with the concrete ballast blocks still in the lower holds put her waterline approximately 18 inches below where she needed to be for comfortable river transit at low water. That margin was manageable in normal tidal conditions. I turned to the tide table page for day 28. I had to read the number twice. Day 28 carried the lowest predicted tide of the calendar month for this stretch of the Neches, a combination of lunar cycle and seasonal pressure pattern that pushed the low water mark down by an additional 11 inches below the standard datum. At 5 in the morning, 1 hour before Callum's berth closure order took effect, the river would be running at its shallowest point of the month. Callum had not chosen that date because it fell conveniently before the contract deadline. He had chosen it because he had done the same calculation I was doing now, and he had arrived at the same answer. At low water on day 28, the Iron Meridian carrying her current ballast load would not have sufficient clearance to exit the berth under her own power. She would sit in the mud while the tow crews arrived at 6, and the contract clause about voluntary psychiatric admission would activate on schedule. A second trap laid beneath the first one. The legal deadline was the visible mechanism. The tide was the hidden one. I picked up the phone and called Rafferty at 11 o'clock. "Do you still have the air chamber calculations from the pontoon work?" I asked. "I'm looking at the drawings right now," he said. I could hear the faint sound of pencil on paper in the background. A pause. Then, "Mr. Voss, if we pull the ballast blocks and complete the remaining chamber installations, the Iron Meridian will ride at least 70 minutes above the low water mark on day 28. Enough clearance to exit the berth before Callum's tow crews are on the water." "How long to complete it?" I asked. 4 days, he said, "if we start tomorrow morning." Callum had done the math on the tide. He had looked at the calendar, found the lowest water of the month, and built his berth closure order around it, a clean piece of planning, the kind that looks inevitable on paper. He was correct in his calculation. With the Iron Meridian carrying her original ballast load, she would not have the clearance to exit the berth at low water on day 28. The numbers did not lie. What Callum had not calculated was that I would change the numbers. On the morning of the 20th day, I went into the lowest accessible space on the vessel, the ballast compartment beneath the cargo hold floor. a space roughly 5 feet high and running most of the ship's beam. The concrete ballast lining was original to the 1989 build, poured-in-place blocks set in a continuous layer across the compartment floor and partway up the lower hull sides, designed to provide stability and keep the vessel's center of gravity where a flat-bottomed river barge needed it. The blocks were old. They were also heavy, numerous, and entirely in my way. I started with a cold chisel and a 4-pound hammer and worked in 4-hour shifts. Concrete that has been curing for 35 years does not yield easily, but it does yield especially in a marine environment where the humidity has worked into the aggregate over decades, compromising the internal bond structure. The first block took 40 minutes. By the third day, I had developed a consistent approach: score the perimeter joints, drive the chisel into the seam, use the lever action to fracture the block into manageable sections, and pass the pieces up through the cargo hold hatch to the deck for Gideon to collect after dark. Gideon moved the debris in his port maintenance truck late enough each night that the dock was quiet. He did not complain about the hours. He had not complained about anything since the afternoon at the anchor and rail when he looked at a map of the river and decided he was done being a bystander. Rafferty ran the displacement numbers, continuously updating the draft calculation after each shift. He had a spreadsheet that pulled from the vessel's original design specifications, the same documents I had filed with the Classification Society in 1989, which he had obtained from the Maritime Registry, and he adjusted it each time I reported the estimated tonnage removed. On the evening of the 21st day, he told me I had recovered 1.4 tons. On the 22nd, 2.9. The target was 3.8. On the morning of the 23rd, I cleared the last section of ballast from the port aft corner of the compartment. Gideon came aboard at midday and measured the freeboard with a marked rod against the hull, 16 inches of additional clearance above the original waterline. In the ballast compartment where the concrete had been, I installed 24 sealed metal tanks, each fabricated from Schedule 40 steel pipe capped and welded at both ends. I had built them in Gideon's warehouse over the preceding evenings, simple construction. Nothing that required more than a welder and a pipe cutter, but built to hold pressure reliably. I charged each tank to 150 pounds per square inch through a Schrader valve before sealing it into the compartment framing. At that pressure, the air volume inside each tank displaced water that the hull would otherwise have to support, adding positive buoyancy at a level I could calculate precisely. The system worked alongside what Rafferty had installed in Task 11, rather than instead of it. The 6 aluminum titanium pontoon chambers on the outer hull provided buoyancy from outside the vessel's skin-sealed air pockets between the original plating and the reinforcement panels, acting on the hull's exterior geometry. The 24 internal tanks provided buoyancy from inside the ballast space displacement, working on the hull's interior volume. The two systems operated on different physical planes, and their contributions to total lift were additive. They did not interfere with each other. They compounded. I had designed both elements with that relationship in mind. Not because I had foreseen Callum's tidal trap specifically, but because good engineering requires redundancy. And redundancy in buoyancy design means understanding that two independent systems providing the same service are worth more than one system providing twice the capacity. Rafferty called at 7 on the evening of the 23rd. He had completed the integrated calculation using the final ballast removal figures Gideon had confirmed that afternoon, incorporating both the external pontoon chambers and the internal compressed air tanks, and running the result against the tide table for the morning of day 28. Combined system gives you 78 minutes above the low water datum, he said. That's from the point the tide hits its lowest mark until it recovers enough to create a risk of clearance loss. You have a 78-minute window to get out of the berth and into the main channel before the geometry works against you again. A pause. From a buoyancy standpoint, Mr. Voss, you've neutralized the tidal trap. There's still the engine, I said. And 5 days. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. After I ended the call, I stayed in the engine room. The overhead work light a single bulb on a drop cord I had strung from the deck above, threw a hard circle of yellow onto the primary drive assembly. The main engine sat at the center of that circle, the way a patient sits in a hospital bed, present not functioning, waiting for a decision to be made about it. 7 years without running. Bearing faces, fused or near-fused carbon accumulation throughout the combustion system, fuel injection components of unknown condition, cooling lines that had likely developed scale deposits throughout their length. I had documented all of it on the first night, and had not let myself think about the full scope of the job until now, because thinking about it too early would have consumed attention I needed for everything else. Now there was nothing left but this. I picked up my notebook from the deck beside the tool bag, the wire-bound graph paper notebook I had carried since 1979, and turned to the first page of notes I had written on that initial inspection. The handwriting from that night was slightly less steady than my usual hand, which I noticed and did not remark on even to myself. I read through every line I had written. Then I turned to a clean page, uncapped the pen, and began the work list for the engine. 5 days, 1 engine, everything else was done. Cordelia called me at 6 in the morning. The secondary storage facility on the Voss Marine Industrial Lot, a corrugated metal warehouse on the south end of the shipyard property that had appeared on none of the company's public-facing site. Maps had been emptied overnight. She had a contact at the Port Authority who had noticed the truck activity after midnight and photographed the loading. By the time the warehouse doors were open in the morning, there was nothing inside but empty pallet racks and the particular clean smell of a space that has been recently and thoroughly wiped down. Callum had moved fast. I had expected that. What he had not considered, what I suspected he had never once thought about, was that the river had already taken custody of his evidence years before either of us arrived at this point in the argument. Rafferty went in on the third dive at 7 that morning. He was in the water 12 minutes after arriving at the dock. No extended preparation, no adjustment period, no visible hesitation at the waterline. He handed me his phone, lowered himself off the stern ladder, and went under. I watched the guide rope and timed him. He was down for 31 minutes. When he surfaced, he passed up 4 sealed sample containers before he even cleared the ladder the way a professional passes tools before climbing down from a height. He was faster each time. That was the only measure that mattered. The samples went into the cooled transport case Vivian had left on the dock the previous evening. Oyster clusters scraped from the hull plating below the waterline. Benthic organisms from the sediment at 5 points around the discharge pipe outlet, and 2 cores of river-bottom substrate from directly beneath the pipe's historical flow path. Living material, all of it. Organisms that had been in continuous contact with whatever the river carried for years, accumulating compounds in their tissue at a rate directly proportional to the concentration and duration of exposure. Beaumont Hale arrived from Houston at 10 o'clock. He was shorter in person than the video screen had suggested. Compact and deliberate, the kind of man whose stillness in a room has a specific quality to it. The quality of someone who has learned that patience produces better evidence than urgency. He shook my hand on the dock, looked at the iron meridian for a moment without comment, and then followed me to the Lamar University Environmental Sciences building, where Vivian had been working since before dawn. The laboratory smelled of reagent and recycled air. Vivian had the preliminary results already framed on the analysis board, the isotope ratio data from the biological samples set against the reference profile she had built from the chemical supplier's registered formulation. She walked Beaumont through the methodology, the way she had walked me through the blood panel results 3 weeks earlier, without condescension, without drama. In the precise language of someone presenting findings they are prepared to defend in any forum. The chromium and cadmium signatures in the biological samples were not generic industrial contamination. They carried a specific isotope ratio, the ratio produced by the particular electroplating and surface treatment. Compounds sourced from the supplier under contract to Voss Marine Industries for the past 11 years. That ratio was a chemical fingerprint. It existed because different ore sources and different processing methods produce subtly different isotope distributions, and those distributions are preserved through the industrial chain into the final product, and from the final product into whatever environment receives the discharge. Callum could empty every warehouse on the Voss Marine property. He could destroy every billing record and every internal report. He could not reach into the tissue of every oyster cluster on the hull of the Iron Meridian and remove what those organisms had been absorbing for years, while the ship sat in the water above his discharge pipe. Living organisms cannot falsify their own chemistry, I told Beaumont. They accumulate what is present in their environment in real time. What Vivian is showing you is not a snapshot of current conditions. It is a chronological record, the biological equivalent of a dated ledger. The concentration gradient in the tissue samples corresponds to years of sustained exposure, not a single contamination event. Beaumont studied the data for a long time. He asked Vivian 4 specific technical questions. She answered each one. He wrote in his notepad throughout and did not look up while writing. Then he set the pen down and signed the formal investigation order. The order covered Voss Marine Industries in its entirety, all facilities, all vessels, all financial records, all communications within the scope of the environmental and criminal referral. Callum would not be moving any further documentation. The federal freeze was effective from the moment Beaumont's signature dried on the page. Vivian waited until Beaumont had finished signing before she placed the second folder on the table. She had received the forensic tissue analysis results 2 days earlier through the court order she had filed in week 2. She had told me they were coming and had not told me what they said, which I had understood without asking her to explain. She opened the folder and placed the summary page in front of Beaumont, and then she looked at me. The liver tissue samples from Rosalind's pathology archive showed chromium and cadmium concentrations consistent with chronic low-level exposure over a period of 3 to 6 years prior to her death. The isotope ratio in her tissue matched the Voss Marine supplier fingerprint within the margin of analytical error. Her oncologist had recorded the tumor presentation as idiopathic cause unknown because at the time of her diagnosis, there had been no environmental investigation to connect her case to. There was one now. Beaumont looked at me across the laboratory table. I looked back at him. Vivian placed her hand on my forearm lightly and left it there. Nobody in the room said anything for a long time. The ventilation system ran. A centrifuge in the adjacent room completed its cycle and clicked off. Outside, through the narrow laboratory window, the Netches moved south toward the Gulf in the afternoon light, the same river it had always been carrying everything it had ever been given. Beaumont spoke first. "I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Voss," he said. His voice was measured and quiet, the voice of a man who chooses those words because they are accurate and not because they are easy. "And I need you to understand from this point forward, this is no longer an environmental case. This is a criminal matter." I drove back to the dock in the late afternoon. The sun was low over the refinery stacks to the west. The sky behind them, the particular orange that Gulf Coast evenings produce in summer. My phone rang as I turned onto the waterfront road. "Gideon." "Callum is at Dock 7, he said. "Alone. No Pemberton, no attorneys, no staff. He's standing on the pier looking at the ship." I slowed the truck. "What does he look like?" A pause on the line. The pause of a man deciding how to describe something he has not seen before. For the first time, Gideon said, "He looks like a boy." I pulled into the dock road and saw him before I cut the engine. Callum was standing at the far end of Dock 7 with both hands in his jacket pockets. looking at the iron meridian the way a person looks at something they have been avoiding thinking about and have finally run out of ways to avoid. His back was to me. The afternoon light came off the niches at a low, late-day angle, the kind that turns rust into copper and makes old timber look like it was chosen for the color rather than worn into it. He did not turn when I parked. He did not turn when my boots hit the dock planking and I walked toward him. When he was 7 years old, he used to stand exactly that way, hands deep in his pockets, weight forward on his toes, looking up at dry-docked hulls in the yard with his head tilted slightly back. He had a particular question. He asked every single time during that period of his childhood, the way children return to a question that has not yet yielded a satisfying answer. He wanted to know why steel floats. Not whether it floats, he could see that it did, but why. What the principle was that allowed something so obviously heavy to sit on the surface of water rather than go through it. I had explained displacement to him so many times that by the time he was 9, he could explain it back to me correctly in sequence with the variables identified. That boy was still inside the man at the end of this dock. I held on to that as I walked. I stopped beside him and looked at the ship without speaking first. "How far along are you?" he asked. His eyes stayed on the hull. "Far enough to leave," I said. The river moved past us slow and brown and constant, the way the Neches has always been. A pelican worked the shallows on the far bank. Somewhere up the channel, a tug horn sounded once and received no answer. "I know you found the recording," Callum said. "Yes. And you know about me." "Yes." He turned then. The first time he had looked directly at me since the boardroom 25 days ago. The afternoon light was not flattering to certainty, and he was not wearing any. His face held the expression of a man who has been carrying a specific question for years without finding a place to set it down, and who has come here to this dock, to this conversation, because he has run out of other options. "And you're still here," he said. "Where would I go?" He looked back at the water. "I'm not your son, biologically." I turned to face him. "Have you ever built something from nothing with your hands, from raw material, start to finish, when you build a thing yourself? You know every corner of it differently than you know anything you simply acquired. You know the seam you rushed on a Thursday afternoon because the light was going, and you know the hour on Saturday morning when you went back and did it properly. That knowledge doesn't transfer. It belongs to the act of building." I kept my voice level and unhurried. "Shadida, I drove your mother to the hospital at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in February. I was in that room when you came into the world. I held you before you had a name. A laboratory result cannot reach back that far and change what happened in that room." Callum's jaw worked. He looked at the hull of the iron meridian, at the white paint above the waterline, still faintly blush-colored in patches from where the river water had contacted it 2 days ago. "Then you should understand," he said, "why I understand the anger," I said. "I have understood it since Barnaby read me that letter. What I cannot follow, what I have spent 25 days trying to trace the logic of, is the method. The waste in the river. The children in the hospital. Rafferty." I paused. "That is not anger. That is something else entirely." The silence that followed was long enough to have a shape to it. Not hostile, something more complex, the silence of a conversation that has gone somewhere neither participant fully planned. Then Callum straightened. I watched it happen, the slow reassembly of the exterior he wore in every professional setting, the posture and the controlled expression settling back into place, the way a bulkhead panel goes back up after a compartment has been opened for inspection. By the time he turned from the rail, he was wearing most of it. 3 days, he said. The contract is still in effect. He walked. I watched him go. His footsteps were deliberate, and even on the dock planking, the measured pace of a man who is concentrating on the mechanics of walking because it gives him something specific to control. He cleared the first piling, the second. At the third, approximately 5 steps from where the dock met the shore, he stopped. He did not turn around. Did she know? The voice was different, quieter by several registers, stripped of the boardroom tone, stripped even of the guarded quality it had carried during the conversation just now. It was the voice of a person asking the one question they actually came to ask, after every other question has been used up. About me, what I am, whether I... He stopped, started again. Did she know? I looked at the set of his shoulders, the stillness of a man holding himself very carefully in place while waiting for an answer that will either confirm the worst thing he believes about himself or give him something else to carry instead. She knew everything, I said. She knew before you did. She had known for years before she wrote that letter. I let a moment pass. And she loved you more than she loved any of the things she knew. Callum stood at the end of that dock without moving for a long time. The river ran behind him. The sun dropped another degree toward the refinery stacks. A heron lifted from the far bank and moved south along the waterline unhurried, and was gone. Callum did not move until after the heron was out of sight. Then he walked off the dock and around the corner of the warehouse, and the sound of his footsteps disappeared. He had walked in fast. He walked out slow. That was the only measurable thing the conversation had produced, and I held it as carefully as I held anything that afternoon. I stood at the dock rail for another minute and looked at the water where he had been standing. Then I walked back up the gangway through the cargo hold and down into the engine room. The work light threw the same yellow circle it had thrown every night for 4 weeks. The main engine sat at the center of it exactly as I had left it, cold steel, 7 years of silence. A machine that had last run during a different chapter of the same life I was still living. I placed both hands flat on the valve cover where the metal was thickest, where the vibration would first be felt when the engine finally ran, cold, still. Waiting, the same word I would have used for myself. 25 days behind me, 3 ahead. The buoyancy was solved. The steering was mechanical. The evidence was in federal hands. The legal trap was sprung. Every preparation that could be made had been made, and every one of them had been built around this room, this engine, this final job. I opened my notebook to the work list from the night of the 23rd. Then I picked up the first wrench. I have rebuilt marine engines my entire working life. I know the specific resistance of a seized bolt that has not moved in a decade, the way the wrench loads before it breaks free. The small sound of metal releasing metal that carries a different quality from ordinary torque. I know the smell of diesel combustion chambers that have been dry for years, and the particular grit of carbon deposits that have had time to bond with the metal beneath them, rather than merely coat it. I have worked on engines in conditions that were cold, wet, confined, and loud at hours of the day when no sensible person would choose to be awake. But I had never worked on an engine that I remembered building. This one I had assembled in 1989 with a crew of 4. I knew which fasteners were torqued to spec and which had been brought up slightly tight because the foreman liked the additional margin. I knew where the wiring harness had been rerouted during the final installation because the original path conflicted with a late change to the fuel line. I knew the engine the way you know a piece of work you did not merely operate but made, and that knowledge 35 years later was worth more than any service manual. I also knew that if it did not run before dawn on day 28, none of the rest of it mattered. I started at the fuel injection system because that was where I expected the worst of it. The injectors had been sitting dry in a contaminated environment for 7 years, and diesel injector nozzles do not tolerate extended dormancy gracefully. All 4 were partially blocked too severely. I pulled them, suspended them in a cleaning solution I had prepared from diesel fuel and a commercial corrosion dissolver, and set them aside. 12 hours minimum. I moved to the next problem. The main bearings were a longer diagnosis. I pulled the inspection covers and measured the journals with the calipers I had carried in the bottom of my tool bag since before the turn of the century. The port side main bearing showed uneven wear, not catastrophic, but enough that reinstalling it as found would produce vibration at operating RPM that would eventually damage the crankshaft. I spent 6 hours reworking it by hand, using a flat scraper and a surface plate to redistribute the wear pattern across the bearing face. It was the kind of work that cannot be rushed, because rushing it produces a result that is worse than the original problem. Gideon brought food at midnight, and again at 8 in the morning, and did not stay because he understood that staying would require me to talk, and talking would cost time I did not have. Rafferty called twice to check on progress, and each time I gave him a number hours remaining, estimated completion of the current task, and he translated it into the timeline calculation and told me where I stood. By the morning of day 27, I was behind the pace I had set, and both of us knew it, and neither of us said it aloud. The cooling system took 4 hours I had not budgeted for. The heat exchanger was fouled with mineral scale to a degree that would have prevented adequate temperature. Regulation under load, a condition that would not manifest until the engine was actually running, at which point the damage would be rapid and irreversible. I discovered it by running water through the circuit, while the injection system was still soaking and watching the pressure differential build where it had no reason to build. I cleared each passage in sequence with a wire probe and a hand pump flush working from the exchanger outlet back to the inlet until the flow rate was what the design specification required. In the hours between problems during the long middle stretches of a task that did not require continuous attention but could not be left, I let myself remember things. The morning in 1989 when we lowered this engine into the hull with a chainfall, Rosalind on the dock above watching through the hatch opening, calling down updates on the alignment marks I had painted on the hull frames as reference points. Her voice in that confined space had a particular clarity, the way voices carry in engine rooms, off the steel surfaces without the absorption that soft furnishings provide. I could hear it as clearly as I could hear the tools in my hands. Callum, at 3 years old, asleep in the corner of this same compartment on a pile of rags while I worked a late shift because the sitter had canceled and Rosalind had a meeting she could not move. He had slept for 4 hours on a diesel-smelling pile of work rags and woken up cheerful with a smear of grease on his cheek that I did not notice until we were already in the car. I had driven home with one hand on the wheel and one hand on the back of his car seat, the way parents do when the child has stopped talking and they need to verify the silence is sleep and not something else. I did not allow myself to think too long about any single memory. I let them come through and kept working. At 4:40 in the morning on day 28, I reinstalled the last injector and torqued the hull down to spec. I primed the fuel system, verified oil pressure at the gauge, checked the coolant level, and traced every electrical connection in the starting circuit, from the battery terminals to the starter motor solenoid. I found one corroded terminal at the solenoid ground and cleaned it with sandpaper until the copper showed through. At 5 o'clock exactly, Gideon knocked 3 times on the hull. Slow measured the signal we had agreed on. The tug was in the channel. Beaumont's number appeared on my phone screen. I answered without stopping work. 20 minutes out, he said. We're coming in from the south approach. Tipiho, I said and ended the call. At 5:15, I moved to the throttle control and set it to idle position. I opened the decompression valves on all 4 cylinders to reduce cranking load. I verified the gear selector was in neutral. Then I reached up and pressed the start button. The starter motor engaged. The crankshaft turned. The engine did not fire. I waited 30 seconds, checked that the fuel rack was responding, verified the decompression valves had reseated, and pressed the button again. The crankshaft turned again longer this time. the injectors priming with each pass, and again the engine did not fire. Above me, Gideon's knock on the hull came faster. 400 meters. I knew the tug's approach speed. I had 8 minutes at most before she was close enough to make departure a physical confrontation rather than a race. I stood in front of the engine in the work light and looked at it the way I had looked at structural problems my entire career, not panicking at what was wrong, but reading what the machine was telling me. The cranking sound was strong. The fuel system was primed. The compression was adequate for starting. There was one variable I had not accounted for fully. An engine that has not run in 7 years does not trust its own systems until it has been asked to run. The first attempt distributes fuel. The second attempt seats the injectors. The third attempt has everything it needs. I pressed the button a third time. The starter turned the crankshaft, and the crankshaft reached the compression point on cylinder 1, and the injector fired. And the combustion event that followed was not the clean ignition of a well-maintained engine, but something rougher and older and more fundamental, a cough, then a catch, then a sustained detonation that spread to cylinder 2 and cylinder 3 and cylinder 4 in the space of 3 seconds. And the engine that I had built in 1989 and last heard running in 2017 came alive in the hold of the ship I had also built. And the sound of it filled the engine room and traveled up through the steel of the hull and out across the water of the Neches River in the dark before dawn. The whole vessel shook with it, not violently, but with the deep whole-body vibration of a machine doing what it was built to do. I put both hands flat on the valve cover. The metal was warming under my palms. The tachometer climbed to idle RPM and held there steady without hunting. I had not cried in a long time. I did not cry now exactly, but I stood in that engine room with my hands on that engine, and I felt something move through the back of my throat and behind my eyes that I did not try to name or manage or stop. I gave myself 30 seconds. At 5:22, I climbed the ladder to the wheelhouse. Through the forward window, the niches stretched out ahead in the first gray light of early morning, the river surface flat and dark. The far bank a low smudge, the sky to the east, beginning to separate from the water at the horizon. 400 meters south, the running lights of Callum's tug were visible and moving. I sat down in the helmsman's chair for the first time in 7 years. The rope and pulley steering linkage was rigged and ready. The magnetic compass in its brass housing read the heading I needed, 78 minutes above the low water mark. Rafferty's number confirmed by the tide tables, confirmed by the freeboard measurement, confirmed by the weight calculations. 78 minutes in which this ship could move, and the tug could not stop her without a physical act that would be witnessed, photographed, and federal in its implications. I reached forward and released the bowline from the deck cleat. Then the stern line, the iron meridian moved. There are moments when everything you have done across many years compresses into a single instant. I have heard people describe this phenomenon, and I always assumed it was a figure of speech, a way of assigning retroactive significance to an outcome that could have gone differently. Standing at the helm of the Iron Meridian at 5:22 in the morning on the 28th day of June, with the engine running beneath me and the Neches River opening ahead in the first gray light, I understood that it was not a figure of speech at all. It was a physical sensation. 70 years of a life arriving at a single point on a river in southeast Texas before sunrise, with the smell of diesel exhaust and river water, and the particular damp of early summer air coming through the broken wheelhouse window. I did not think about Callum. I did not think about the contract or the deadline or the tug that was 400 meters behind me and closing. I thought about Rosalind in a red dress standing on a riverbank in 1989, clapping with both hands raised above her head. The rope steering linkage responded cleanly as I brought the bow around to the channel, heading heavier than a power system, requiring deliberate input, but responsive in the way that direct mechanical connection always is. No software between my hands and the rudder, No signal processing, no latency. I turned the wheel and the ship turned with me, and we came off the dock face and into the main current of the niches as the sky above the eastern tree line began to separate from dark into gray. I advanced the throttle in stages the way you do with an engine that has been dormant and needs to be brought up through its temperature range before asking it for load. The tachometer climbed. The vibration through the deck plates changed character as the RPM increased from the rough idle of a cold start to the steadier pulse of a machine finding its operating rhythm. Behind the stern, the prop wash churned white against the dark water. Gideon's voice came over the handheld radio he had left in the wheelhouse. "She's clear of the berth. Tug is at the entrance to the dock channel. They can see you." "Copy," I said. The Iron Meridian moved through the low-water approach with clearance to spare the freeboard gained from 28 days of work, holding exactly as Rafferty's calculations had promised. The tug reached the berth entrance and stopped. There was nothing for it to do. The berth was empty. The ship it had come to impound was in the navigable channel under its own power, on the correct side of the deadline Callum himself had set. I brought the engine back to idle when I reached the midstream position and let the anchor run. The chain paid out through the hawse pipe in the old way link by link, and the ship settled on the hook in the current, with the engine ticking over at low RPM. I went down the accommodation ladder to the skiff I had tied at the stern, cast off, and rowed to the dock. The barge was already there when I climbed the ladder onto the pier. 3 vehicles, Beaumont's EPA-marked Suburban, a Beaumont PD unit, a second federal vehicle with U.S. government plates. Cordelia stood near the dock office with a camera bag at her feet and a long lens already mounted, not shooting, yet waiting. Rafferty's van was parked at the end of the lot, his chair visible through the open side door. Vivian was standing at the water's edge with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the river. Gideon met me at the top of the ladder, and we stood side by side without speaking for a moment, looking at the Iron Meridian riding at anchor in the middle of the Neshes. Callum's car arrived at 5:41. He came alone, which I had not expected. No attorney, no Pemberton, no driver. He parked at the far end of the dock and walked toward the water with the deliberate pace of a man who has been awake all night and is past the point of performing composure. He saw the federal vehicles. He saw Beaumont waiting near the dock entrance. He stopped walking. He looked out at the river, at the Iron Meridian sitting in the channel, with her running lights still on and her engine turning over in the morning quiet, exactly where she had no business being, according to every calculation he had made. Beaumont walked to him with 2 agents behind him and delivered the federal arrest warrant in the level, procedural tone of someone who has done this before and understands that the moment does not require additional weight, it carries its own. Conspiracy to discharge hazardous waste into navigable waters, environmental fraud, aggravated assault, Rafferty Cole, falsification of federal agency documents, and pursuant to Clause 7B of the Asset Transfer Agreement, executed on the 1st of June, full financial liability for all environmental violations arising from the operational history of Voss Marine Industries vessels during the period of Callum's ownership and direction, estimated at $340 million in civil remediation and penalties calculated. Across 7 years of documented discharge at 7 sites under Clean Water Act daily violation rates, Callum listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. When Beaumont finished, he looked at him and said, "That's the contract I signed." "True, yes, sir," Beaumont said. "It is." I walked across the dock and stood in front of my son. He looked at me. Not with the cold calculation of the boardroom, and not with the stripped vulnerability of the conversation at the river 2 days ago, something in between. The look of a man who has arrived at the end of a road he chose, and is standing at the terminus trying to understand how it came to this. "Why would you do this to your own son?" he said. I looked at him in the early morning light, at the face I had watched for 32 years, in hospital rooms, and school hallways and boardrooms and on this same waterfront. I taught you everything I knew about building things, I said. I assumed somewhere in that teaching you had learned to understand the difference between what can be owned and what cannot. I was wrong about that. And a man has to correct his mistakes no matter how long it takes and no matter how large they are. The agents moved him toward the vehicle. He passed Rafferty's chair on the way. Callum stopped for 1 second, one beat, not long enough to constitute a decision, just long enough to register. He looked at Rafferty. Rafferty looked back at him without expression, without gesture, with the complete stillness of a man who has nothing left to prove and knows it. Then Callum walked on. Gideon put his hand on my shoulder. Vivian did not move from the water's edge. Cordelia raised her camera not for the arrest, but for the river, for the ship at anchor in the morning light. The engine sound, carrying across the flat water in the quiet before the port came to life. The Iron Meridian held her position in the current engine running lines, slack, going nowhere and needing to go nowhere. She had done what she was asked to do. She had left the dock under her own power before the deadline. Whatever came next, the federal proceedings, the civil litigation, the long administrative process of accounting for what had been put into this river, that was the work of courts and agencies and time. I put my hand into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out the folded contract. 4 pages, $50, 30 days. The document Callum had pushed across a conference table on a Tuesday morning in June, certain it was the last thing he would ever need to give me. I looked at it for a moment. The paper was worn at the fold lines from a month in my pocket. The signature at the bottom was Callum's, hurried, barely legible. The signature of a man who had not bothered to read what he was signing because he was already thinking about what came next. I folded it carefully and put it in my wallet. Not because I needed it. The legal process would run its course without this copy in my possession. But Rosalind's hand had touched this document. Through the years she had spent building the clause that made it mean something, through Barnaby's drafting, through her patient construction of a trap that could only be sprung by arrogance, through the particular faith she had placed in the idea that this day would eventually come. It was the last thing she had left me. On the Natchez River, in the light of a June morning, the Iron Meridian sat at anchor with her engine running and let the current move past her the way the river had always moved south, steady, toward the Gulf, carrying everything it had ever been given. I sat on the bow of the ship, watching the Natchez flow southward, thinking about what 30 days had taught a 68-year-old man. There is a verse in the Bible I never truly understood until this morning. The truth will set you free. Not money, not power. Only the truth held in the right place at the right time. By the right person. Rosalind understood that years before I did. These are the grandpa stories I never wanted to tell, but had to. Because I was wrong about something important. I built ships, built a company, built everything, but I did not build enough conversations with my own son. Do not be like me. If someone is drifting away from you right now, do not wait until day 25 on a dock to say what is true. Grandpa stories like this are not about triumph. They are about the quiet cost of everything left unspoken inside a family story. We convinced ourselves was fine. In my view, a family story is never just one person's story. It is the sum of everything left unsaid, everything people pretend not to see, and everything held back because someone believed silence was protection. Sometimes real love looks like confrontation. Sometimes protecting your family means letting things break apart before they can be rebuilt the right way. These grandpa stories come from an ordinary man, imperfect, no hero, who learned the truth 3 years slower than his wife did. But he learned. And this is also the family story of more families than anyone wants to admit, simply waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with me until the very last line that means more than you know. Note: the stories ahead may contain fictional elements crafted purely for educational and reflective purposes. If this is not the content you are looking for, please feel free to choose something that suits you better. There is no judgment here.